All right, welcome. We're going to do our notes for our next unit, the first unit of trimester 2, which is cells. And we're going to introduce the idea of what is a cell, and we're going to learn about some of the cell parts. Before we get into that, we want to look at some of the important vocab that we learned back in trimester 1. We're going to talk about what it is to be an autotroph or a heterotroph, unicellular, multicellular, eukaryote, prokaryote, because each of those has to do with cells quite a bit. So, prokaryotes. These are organisms that don't have a nucleus, and we can actually see these things with a microscope. They are always unicellular, so when we talk about them, we'll be talking about bacteria and archaea. And because they don't have a nucleus, they cannot be specialized. The opposite of a prokaryote is a eukaryote. These do have a nucleus. You can have a unicellular eukaryotic cell. That would be something like a protist. However, most eukaryotes are multicellular. Things like animals and plants and fungus, where because they have a nucleus, those cells can communicate to each other and they can get big and grow and be multicellular. These, because they have lots of cells and all those cells are working together, eukaryotes can be specialized. Think about it like a school. If a school has lots of teachers, some of the teachers can teach Phi Ed, and some of the teachers can teach science, and some can teach math, and some teach ELA. But if I was the only teacher in the whole school, one, I would be very tired. But two, it would be hard for me to just teach everything. If I had to do everything at the school, I couldn't specialize. I couldn't be like Mr. Peterson, the orchestra teacher. I can't just teach orchestra because students would also have to learn some math, and they'd also have to learn some ELA and lots of other stuff. So it's important, if you have lots of cells, you can give each of them a certain job. That's called specialization. If you're a prokaryote, you need to be simple, and you can only have one cell work by itself because it has to do everything. It has to get the food, and it has to reproduce, and it has to, control what goes in and out of it. It can't specialize in a certain job. Next, we'll talk about autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that get their energy from the sun, things like plants and some protists. Even there are a couple bacteria that can get their energy from the sun. So, autotrophs have special parts in their cells, and we'll learn about those next week, where they can take energy from the sun and make their own food. Heterotrophs don't have those parts. Heterotrophs, like us, animals, archaea, most bacteria, fungus, and some protists, they have to eat things. They have to get their energy by absorbing things around them. And when they do, they can take that sugar and that food and they can process it and they can turn it into energy. So, we are studying cells because cells are the basic unit of life. They are the building block of life. All living things are made of cells because it's at the cellular level that all of these functions, all of the parts of Mr. El Grumo actually happen. We need materials. Well, great, we've got blood cells that carry oxygen to our body. We need food. Well, sugar gets passed along in our blood too, and we've got special cells like your stomach cells that break food down into parts that we can actually use. We need protection, so we've got skin cells and we've got bone cells for support. We need to be able to reproduce, so we have sperm cells and egg cells. And so Whatever organism you're talking about, if it's alive, it has cells carrying out all the different parts of Mr. El Grumo. That means it's a living thing. There are smaller things, smaller than a cell, but on their own, they can't carry out life functions. So that's why we say cells are the building blocks of life. But cells are made up of different things too. And so the tiny structures found inside cells are called organelles. They each have their own jobs. We've got, and we're going to learn all about them. We've got things like the nucleus and mitochondria, and we've got lysosomes and Golgi apparatus and all kinds of different things. Just like you have organs inside your body, like you have a heart and you have lungs and you have a liver and a stomach and a brain. These are all organs that help you carry out the functions of day to day life. Cells have organelles, little tiny parts that make up the cell that help them carry out and do the functions that make us alive. Now, cells are important because, like we said, all things are made of cells. And so we have what are called cell theory. To scientists, these seem very basic and they might seem pretty common sense to you, but it took scientists a while to figure these out and figure out why we are different than, say, a rock or the wind. And so we look at these polar bears and we can say, well, what's special about them? Well, they're multicellular. They're big. It takes millions of cells to make up something as big as that polar bear. Um, Cells also carry out functions needed to support life. As I mentioned in the last slide, you have different parts in your cells called organelles, and each of those carry out different things. If you need to, get bigger, your cell needs to copy itself, and there's parts of the cells that do that. If you need to respond to your environment and take in more water, then you have parts of your cell that are going to do that as well. And so, without those cells to carry out those life functions like growing and reproducing and responding to changes in your environment, you wouldn't be able to live. And lastly, cells come from other living cells. The polar bears, the little baby, adorable little polar bears that are sitting next to the big mama bear there, they didn't just poof, fall from the sky. And she went, oh, cool, they look like me. They started off as one sperm and one egg cell that combined. And so you need cells that reproduce, and you need cells to be able to copy themselves. And we're going to learn about cell division. A long time ago, people used to think that when people got sick, it was just bad luck or they had bad spirits around them. And they didn't understand that it was germs, little tiny one celled organisms like bacteria that were causing them to be sick. And so they just thought, oh, well, they just poof showed up out of nowhere because you couldn't see them. They weren't as big as, say, a polar bear. So these are the basic concepts of cell theory. And once we understand that, now we need to understand what makes cells different. And one of your learning targets that you will be tested on this month is what's the difference between a plant and an animal cell? Now, plants and animal cells take on lots of different shapes and they can look a lot of different ways. But there are a few key differences, a few key parts that you only find in certain types of cells. And so as we look at those and we go through the parts of the cell, you'll see that a lot of those they have in common. But plants are autotrophs, so they're going to have certain parts that animal cells don't have. Animal cells are heterotrophs, and so they're going to have a higher percentage of certain organelles that allow them to process food. And we'll look at each and every one of those as we get going. One thing you might notice right away is the shape. And that is one difference that you will be tested on. So there's a free one. Plant cells tend to look more boxy. Now, that doesn't mean they're always going to be a perfect square or a perfect rectangle, but look on the left. We've got a plant. I believe this is an onion. And look over here. See how this has kind of got a set side, and then there's a nice flat side here, and then a nice flat short end over here, and then it comes back. And there's clear sides to this. This is because plants have what are called a cell wall. We'll learn how they're made and what they are later. Whereas if we go over to the animal cell, it looks like someone just dropped some eggs in a frying pan or just took a frisbee made out of a Kleenex and crumpled it up. They're a little more random. They're rounded, a little more less organized, a little more fluid and free form shape. So animal cells tend to be more round, not perfect circles, but just less stiff sides, whereas plant cells uh, tend to be a little more boxy. All right, we're going to start looking at some of the cell organelles. We'll just do a few today, a couple of the most important ones, and then next week we're going to get into learning all the rest of them. There's way too many to cover in a day, and so I want to stress two of the most important organelles. And the key thing that you need to understand as we go through and look at like what is the organelle and sort of where would it be in a cell, the most important thing is to think about what is its job? What does it do? So let's start with the boss, the nucleus. The nucleus is the control center of the cell. It decides when things are happening, what is happening. It is fully in charge. So right now, this whole pink section, and I know there's this other yellow section, that's just a special part of the nucleus, but that's also inside the nucleus. The nucleus tends to be a larger section of a cell. It's one of the easiest things to spot when we use a microscope. Hopefully you saw that when we did the microscope activity yesterday. So the nucleus is what controls the cell. It sends messages, it takes in information and decides what to do with it. It's in charge of when it's time for the cell to reproduce. That is where all of that process begins. And so as we go through the different parts of the cell, we're going to compare the cell to a school. We're going to say, well, what if the cell was a school? What would this part or this organelle of the cell be? And so the nucleus, because it controls everything, would be like the principal. The principal controls what happens at the school. It makes the important decisions. It decides what teachers are teaching what classes. It decides if students are in trouble or what students get on the honor roll. Um, the principal is kind of the boss, and that is what the nucleus does. Um, any cell that has a nucleus would be a eukaryote, and both plants and animals have a nucleus in every single one of their cells. The nucleus has all of your genetic information in it. So it's all of that DNA, all of your genetic code, all organized and bundled together. And that's what makes all of those decisions. The next organelle we're going to talk about is the cell membrane. Now, the cell membrane in our picture is this purple border. It's very thin. It goes around the entire outside. Of course, we're looking at this as two dimensionals, but our cell is three dimensionals. It's not perfectly flat. So it would go all the way around the cell, just like the peel would go all the way around an orange. And so the cell membrane surrounds the entire cell and it controls what enters and what leaves. Um, if we were to compare it to our school, it would be like the doors. Sometimes you go up to a door at the school and the door is locked and you can't get in. Other times the doors are programmed to be open and you walk right in and other things go out, and that's what decides what can go in and out of the school. Both plants and animal cells both have cell membranes, and it does the same job in both. Cell membranes tend to have, um, it's actually like a super skinny layer of fat, and it allows, like, everything can't get past that layer of fat, but there's, like, embedded in the membrane, there's little proteins, and those proteins allow things to go in and out. And when we talk about it next week, we'll try to give you a little example of what that might look like. So, but the main thing is you understand that their job, the cell membrane's job, is to control what enters and leaves the cell. So, here's a moment for you to review, and you'll see questions pop up on screen in just a bit. But your first question is this: what cell parts can you see in the picture? We've only talked about two, and I hope you can see them both. So look for that and answer the question. Hopefully you saw that there's a nucleus in every single one of these cells, and along the outside edge would be the cell membrane, deciding what goes in and out of the cell, and the nucleus's job is controlling the cell. Now, based on their shape, what type of cell do you think this is? Well, these cells don't have set rigid sides. They're kind of random in their shape. They're kind of rounded on their edges. And so these are animal cells. In fact, they're skin cells off of a human. So, good work. We're going to stop here for today. We'll pick up the other half of the presentation next week. Um, Good job in trimester 1, and we'll pick up cells in trimester 2.